started to eat, and then the nerves were hitting in. I was like, I'm just gonna put this off until. So I have a sandwich in my bag. It was very good. Rob doesn't have any slides, but yeah. All right, y'all ready to go? Cool. All right. Check, check. All right. All right, I think we have a full room and a full panel, so we'll get ahead and get started. Welcome to our panel examining the business case for engaged journalism, which is part of a series of sessions on engagement at this year's festival. I'd like to specifically thank IJF for supporting this series, as well as the Agora Journalism Center, the gathering place for innovation and communication and civic engagement at the University of Oregon. Thanks also to the John S. And James L. Knight Foundation for their support of this session in conjunction with the development of an interactive platform to spread best practices engagement across the globe. As one of the collaborators on that project, I'm excited to share that we now have a name. It's Gather, as well as a landing page where you can find out more about what we've been up to and our plans to launch this spring. So that's letsgather.in. I'll allow the panelists to tell you more about themselves and their work shortly, but just a quick introduction. On the far end is Rob Weinberg from The Correspondent, co-founder and editor-in-chief. Next to him, Ian Gill from Discourse Media, based in Canada. He's the president. And next to me is CEO and founder of Harkin, Jen Brandel. And I'm Ben DeJarnett, project and product manager for Gather. I will pass it off shortly to Jen and the rest of the panelists to do sort of a 10-minute introduction, presentation, then we'll do a little bit of discussion and then open it up to questions from the group. But I first wanted to kind of set the stage for the conversation by explaining what we mean by engagement, as well as why the business question is so important right now. I liked my colleague Andrew Devagal's definition so much that I borrowed his slide. So when we're talking about engagement at the Agora Journalism Center, and really on this panel, less about clicks, likes, retweets, social media metrics, as it is about listening to our audience, telling the stories of our communities with them and not just for them, and turning our sources into storytellers in a way that enriches journalism and engages our communities. In terms of the business side, I could talk a long time about that, but I'll try and just share two numbers that I think sort of capture a snapshot of where we're at. One of them is 65%. That's the amount of total digital advertising revenue that went to just two companies in 2015, Google and Facebook, leaving everyone else on the internet to fight over the other 35%. That sort of dovetails into the other number I wanted to share, which is $28 billion. That's the revenue gap between what U.S. newspapers have gained in digital ad revenue over the last decade compared to what they've lost in print advertising revenue. So just to put numbers on that, between 2004 and 2014, digital advertising revenue for U.S. newspapers grew by $2 billion. During that same period, print advertising fell by $30.3 billion. So all that's to say, digital ad revenue, it's a big part of the pie. It's not going anywhere. It's important for journalism, but increasingly it's not enough, which is why it's great that we have three people here who are really on the front lines of figuring out what next and how else we can support journalism through reader revenue and other opportunities. And the first of those I'd like to pass it off to is Jen Brandel from Harkin.
There we go. Now it is. Thank you, Ian. Right on. Excellent. So I am really excited to tell you about the company I've been running for the last year and a half called Hearken, which the word itself means to listen. And forgive me because it's going to be about 70% explaining what Hearken is, and then we'll get to the monetization at the end, because it really requires an understanding of the nuances of the relationship dynamics, and then you'll see why there's money here. So we help news organizations listen to the public way before they publish stories to make sure that they're doing relevant and valuable work. Quick backstory, I was a reporter for a long time at WBEZ in Chicago. I founded a series there called Curious City that started with the audience's curiosity, and now I'm scaling that idea with Hearken. And so the main question I was obsessed with as a reporter for a really long time is trying to figure out how to know whether stories were valuable or not before reporting and without having to guess. Because right now, with the model that journalism currently has, you can't know for sure before reporting or without guessing. And the way that we found out that you can do this is just putting the public first instead of last in the process. And I'll show you what I mean by this. So typically, most news stories don't have the public involved in any meaningful way until it's too late. After publication, after broadcast, that's when the public can come in. Maybe they can comment, which we know does not bring out the best in humanity all of the time, and doesn't always lead to actionable, meaningful insight into who the public is and what they care about. So what we've done instead is really, so this traditional model, I should say, another way of putting it, is that it's like the newsroom saying, here's what we think you need to know, at a distance, looking at the audience as an abstract group of people, and not really working with them beforehand. So on the flip side, what we've been working on for the last few years is changing this model completely and starting with the audience instead of ending with them and putting them first throughout the process. And so we call this a public-powered story cycle because without the public, these stories don't happen. It's not that the newsroom decides what to do and then they sprinkle a little public on the story. It's without the public, they don't exist. And so it all begins with collecting the public's questions. In other words, it's asking this: what do you not know that we could help you find the answer to? This is the posture that the newsroom takes. Instead of saying, we know what you need to know, we say, what don't you know? And the other two aspects of this, and having the public be involved, is that they can vote on each other's ideas. So you can curate the best questions that come in and let the public ultimately decide what you report on. And then the public can also follow you as you're doing the story and contribute their expertise, their insight, see what's happening as it's happening. So those are the three main ideas behind Hearken. In the last year and a half, we've spread from 3 newsrooms to more than 80 in 18 languages around the world, testing this model in lots of different ways. And we built a custom platform in order to make this simple to do, because really, it's a mental shift more than anything, but when you want to do this over and over again, none of the existing tools make it easy for reporters. So we ended up building a custom tool set to make it easy. So we have these little modules where the public can ask questions, modules where they can vote. This new tool we're just coming out with, we're very excited about, called Open Notebook, where the reporter can show their work as they're going and be transparent about everything that they're doing. And it all ties together in what we call an EMS, so like a CMS, a content management system, but for engagement instead. And so how newsrooms work with this is oftentimes they'll embed these modules on their stories, embed them in sidebars, and collect the audience's feedback as they go. And another cool thing that they can do is when the public, let's say, votes for a question after they're done voting, they can leave their email address so the newsroom can follow up with them after that story is reported in case they miss it on Facebook or on the radio or wherever it might live. So I bring this up because email is one of the main ways that our system works with the newsroom and the public. It's not about Facebook owning the relationship with the audience, it's about the newsroom owning the relationship with their audience, and email is really the key to that. And so at the moment in which people ask questions as well, they can collect email addresses and subscribe to a newsletter or get a deeper relationship with that newsroom. And so I'm going to take you through real quick the process of making these stories. So we made a little subway map to make it easy to get from idea to final answer or story. And the purple line is like your express train, just getting a story out really quickly. So you make a plan, you decide what kinds of questions you want, create a curiosity module, let the public know, and then you collect questions. Could be 10 questions, could be 10 million. It's not about quantity, it's about quality. And so I'll take you through a quick example of how this line works. So the BBC, for example, the Brexit story breaks. They put up all they know at that moment, the breaking news story. At the bottom, they put a module to collect additional questions that the public inevitably has when they read the story so that the BBC knows what reporting to do next. So the public asks these questions, They flow into this one centralized system. They can see patterns, decide what to report on next, and then report an FAQ, essentially the next day. So the public can see those sorts of stories that they were curious about that weren't in the original reporting. And this story performed very well because it was very relevant. And so now I'll take you through just a quick other example of how you can do original reporting with this model as well. So there's a voting round route, which is kind of like the local train. You know, it takes a little bit longer, a little more scenic, but you get more engagement, more email addresses, more relationships. So here's an example from our partner at KQED. They're TV, radio, and digital in San Francisco. And Olivia is the reporter that runs this series called Bay Curious. So with it, they collect the public's questions about San Francisco and the region. And so this guy, Eric, wanted to know about his neighborhood. He lives in a spot where every Sunday there's double parked cars up and down the street, and that's illegal. So he wants to know, why aren't these cars being ticketed and towed? Because they're not allowed. So he asks KQED, Olivia gets the alert for the question, and she decides this is great, but she wants to make sure her public cares about it before she invests her time, money, resources in reporting. So she puts it up for a vote to validate interest in that story. The public gets to vote, and then Eric gets to tell all of his friends, please vote for my question, which is really great marketing for the newsroom, just organic marketing of people rallying their friends and their networks to vote for their questions, and his question ends up winning. So Olivia gets an original story that no other news outlet is doing, plus proof that her audience cares before she's reported a word of the story. So she's got a good sense it's going to perform well, and in fact, it performs very well. So the story does 11 times better than their typical stories, and it's not a fluke, actually. They did a study, and it showed all of these Harkin-powered stories perform 11 to 15 times better than their typical news stories. And so we're seeing this around the world, that when you start with the public and you put them at the center of your model, these stories perform much, much better because they're coming from people's actual curiosity instead of whatever the news of the day is. And so these stories sit at the intersection between really deep audience engagement that leads to original content and over time generates email addresses, insight, and data about who your audience is and what they really care about. So now we're going to get into the monetization aspect of it. So when you think about deep audience engagement, this is a great way of proving your value to the public so that when you ask them to subscribe, to donate, to become a member, to do something that requires money, they feel that connection with you because you are listening to them and you're connected with them. Then when you're doing really popular content that people love, this is great for advertising. So if your news site is really good at collecting CPMs and counting how many clicks and that kind of work, you can make more money on these stories because they perform better. And then for the lead generation, data and insight, you're generating email addresses to convert people to whatever next step of relationship in your newsroom, whether that's a newsletter or, again, to subscriptions or membership models. So those are some of the ways that it's manifesting, and I'll take you through some numbers here. But we've learned that when you put the public at the center of your model, the value follows in lots of different ways. So the return on investment for reporters is they're getting more differentiated, popular stories, which what reporter doesn't want to report original, relevant, popular content? We jokingly call this the holy grail story because it's hard to achieve every time. And then the return on investment for the newsroom that we're seeing is that newsrooms are able to command much higher ad rates because they're putting ads on these modules in the context in which people are engaging. So they're able to charge much more to have these modules sponsored by a community organization or a big company or whatnot. And then also the following content that is produced, a lot of newsrooms are getting advertisers or sponsors for that content for a nice price as well. So WBEZ, the series I founded there, they received more than $40,000 just in having a 30-second message at the end of those stories because those advertisers want to be seen and heard alongside an effort that says we care about the community. So it's a no-brainer for them. And then we're seeing that the generating the emails and converting to membership, we're early days here because a lot of the newsrooms we work with don't have CRMs, customer relationship management systems, and they're not super sophisticated yet in terms of connecting editorial and business. But for some of them who are, we're starting to see great, great results. And I feel like this looks like I'm lying because I have to say the publisher's name is embargoed, but it will be released soon in a study. We're so excited. We just learned one of our partners found that people who engaged with Harkin on their site were 531% more likely to convert to a paying subscriber of that newsroom, which is fabulous. Something we'd always hoped would be true, and now we have some proof. And then at WBEZ, they collected more than 10,000 email addresses just within the first year of Curious City, compared them to their CRM, And they found most of those emails, 56% were new. So these are people who should be members, who should be paying subscribers to the newsroom. And then for newsrooms that have a paywall or some sort of action you have to take in order to get more content, you can use this approach as a way of creating a value add. So saying you can vote, you can ask questions, but to see the final stories, you have to be a member. So it's a good way of kind of giving another reason, a nudge for people to pay. But the real reason I started this, and I wanted to make sure I hit on this too, is a return on investment for the public. The whole reason we do this is to empower the public to have information that they need to make decisions about their lives. So that's hard to put a price tag on that, but that's why we exist. So I'll give you a couple quick examples of that return on investment. So one of our partners in Nashville, someone asked a question about a park that was called Fred Douglass Park. Now in the US, there's a very, very famous abolitionist named Frederick Douglass. His name is spelled a little bit different than Fred Douglass Park. And a person just wanted to know, who is Fred Douglass and why does he have a park? Is he famous? Or was this supposed to be named Frederick Douglass Park? And this was a slight. So the newsroom ended up asking City Council, who is Fred Douglass? Nobody knew. Nobody knew. So they dug some more. Nobody knew who Fred Douglass was, why this park would be named after him. And just a couple weeks ago, the city actually renamed the park to Frederick Douglass Park because they realized it was probably an 80-year-old mistake. So without the newsroom, if a member of the public just called City Hall and said, who's Fred Douglass, will you rename the park? There's no way that would have happened. But because the newsroom was involved, that individual had power that they wouldn't have had otherwise. And so I'll give you another quick example. In Florida, some parents found the dance studio that their daughters took dance classes in just closed abruptly. The owner skipped town. And so they didn't have the time in the day to try and chase down the owner and figure out what happened, but the newsroom was able to, and get the parents' money back, get the kids free dance classes, and have a happy ending to the story. Again, without the newsroom involved, the parents wouldn't have been able to take this action and have this power. And in Chicago, the last example I'll give, this woman, Janice Thompson, wanted to know how much of the electricity in Chicago came from fracked natural gas. And we ended up doing 2 stories about it, both of which said it's really hard to know, and here's why it's hard to know. And so we felt sad because we couldn't get her a good answer because there wasn't a good answer to be found. But meanwhile, because we engaged with her, because we took her along for the story, we explained everything that we were finding, we asked what she thought, she became so interested in this topic, something that she wasn't really that interested in before, she just wanted an answer, that she ended up quitting her job to become an activist in the community to educate her fellow community members about how electricity works and what sustainable choices they can make. So that's just a few quick examples of the return on investment for reporters, and we're seeing there's just lots more that we're looking to get data on. So with that, I will turn it over to Ian. So thank you.
Thanks, Jen. So I feel sandwiched between I feel unfairly sandwiched between Jennifer, whose presentations and whose work is brilliant, and I love it every time I see it, and Rob, who I've been a big fan of for a couple of years. I met him in Perugia 2 years ago when I was writing a book about the collapse of Canadian journalism, and I was also looking for things that were going right in the world in journalism, and all roads led to Rob. But they also led me in Canada to Discourse Media, and so that's what I'm here to talk about today. I was a reporter at the Vancouver Sun for several years after I left Australia. I was a reporter there for 4 years. I was at the Sun, then at the CBC television as a documentary reporter, and then I quit to start a non-profit organisation, which I ran for a few years in Canada, and now I'm back in journalism again. So I've been told that if I do that, that happens. Wow. So the person whose head is there is Erin Miller, who's the founder of Discourse Media. She was here last year. The word that's hidden by her head is the word what, as in what is Discourse Media and who is it for, which are pretty important questions to ask of yourselves if you're going to go out into the world that we're in. So what is Discourse Media? We're a digital journalism startup in Vancouver, Canada, started by Erin 3 years ago. We've survived over those 3 years and in fact grown quite rapidly. And 3 weeks ago we decided to just pause production. We kind of hit the stop button for a week and did what we call a reboot of the company, just to go back and make sure we were all on the same page about what we were doing. And most of our discussion in that reboot was about engagement. We were just really trying to think not only what is discourse media, but who is it actually for? At the end of the reboot camp, I can confidently and with great certainty tell you that Discourse Media is a 3-year-old startup that actually started less than a month ago. So in startup land, nothing stays the same for very long, or as someone put it yesterday, startups are all about agile development. He went on to say that that means that you fail quickly and recover and fail again, and that's what a startup does. We're not that interested in failure, but we're interested in learning, and if we fail at some things, that's okay too. How we currently talk about ourselves after our session of the reboot is that our journalism cuts through the noise to help people make sense of complexity and sparks action on issues impacting underserved communities. And you've got to be careful about how you pronounce and say that word, not undeserved, but underserved communities. So that's what we talk about ourselves, and we've taken a few approaches to, and the other thing is, what I should do is just quantify how many of us there are. There's 12 of us at the moment, editorial staff. 75% of the staff is female. Lindsay Sample in the front row here is our managing editor. She's here. So there's 3 men in the organisation. Two of the other 2 males are Indigenous Canadians. So I am actually the only white male in our organisation, which I don't know if it's good for the organisation, but I think that's a big step forward for global journalism. So just take credit for that. Or give credit to Erin, who just doesn't hire white males routinely. So the question of who discourse is for obviously goes to this notion of, we've got to answer what we think an underserved community is, a community that's essentially underserved by journalism. And the presupposition of going out to serve a community like that is that you're going to engage in a very different way, and that's what we like to think that we're doing. One of the approaches we've taken, and Lindsay presented a bit on this morning, was an international fellowship project called Power Struggle. So 2 billion people in the world are without reliable access to electricity. So that means that 1/5 of the world's schools, hospitals, homes are often in the dark. How can everyone get access to clean energy? It's an urgent question. There's these things called the Millennium Development Goals. None of those get satisfied or achieved if something as fundamental as access to energy is not achieved. So we think that's a question that journalism can help answer. How we went about that is, there's one reporter there of the 9 that we supported last year around the world from areas as far away from each other as northern Canada, the Arctic region, out to Kiribati, into Zimbabwe, Hindustan, countries around the world, where we got funding to fund journalists to be fellows concentrating on solutions journalism related to energy access and availability. What were the solutions in different communities? We sort of had a hub where we brought their stories in, we worked with them, we did some training, we standardized some of the editorial approaches, and then these stories were shared. These were working journalists, so they could publish in their own newspaper or broadcast outfit, but also these stories were shared across those platforms and actually picked up by the New York Times, Al Jazeera, The Guardian, and several other outlets. So the monetization issue about this, I guess, in a way, is that we were able to do some highly engaged, important, we think, global journalism for a fraction of the price it would cost you to do parachute journalism, which is to send a foreign correspondent into communities. We use the correspondents in place and actually help to build their capacity. So we think that was a sort of a useful thing to do. This slide relates to LNG, which is liquefied natural gas. And you'll see a reference to our salmon and our water, our future, our choice. So in northern British Columbia, a bit closer to home, there's some communities there where there are over $100 billion worth of energy developments proposed for this one area. It's a corridor that would have pipelines running from the tar sands in Alberta out to the coast of British Columbia. These communities essentially have no reporting. There's 4 newspapers in the area. They're all owned by the same guy who is an industrialist who wants to build an oil refinery, so they don't report a lot about the other side of energy development. And so this is a phenomenon of news poverty, which exists increasingly in Canada, especially in remote and rural areas. So we sent some reporters up to northern British Columbia. They went to these communities, and what we found was that the government was lying to communities about the consultation and about the effects of these pipelines. We actually found that the Premier of the province was lying about the support she had from Aboriginal chiefs. She was relying upon a meeting where a vote was taken. We found out that the meeting never actually happened, but this was reported dutifully by the southern media as a real thing. So, so we managed to uncover that out, but we also realized that this was sort of traditional journalism. It wasn't necessarily solving anything. We were pointing out the problems. So we sent another reporter, this is Trevor Jang, we sent Trevor up on what we called an engagement road trip. And this was the weirdest assignment I think a journalist has ever had, or certainly Trevor's ever had, because we said, go up to Prince Rupert, this remote community, get yourself a bus ticket, because he doesn't drive, actually it was the real reason, but also you meet lots of people on a bus, and just travel through the region and ask questions. You don't have to write any stories. And he said, well, what are we going to do? We said, we're just going to go and tell people you're a reporter and ask them what they want the reporting to be about in this region. So he said, well, okay, you're paying for it. So off he went. He had a great time, and he found out a lot of things that we would not have known about what, firstly, just other issues, reportable issues, but also really what was on people's minds. And so this is all a way of trying to actually, again, engage with communities in a very different way than just fly in and sort of say, you know, we're from Discourse Media, we're going to write a story, we're here to help you, and then fly back south. Later this year, we're going to be offering another set of fellowships there to potential sort of budding journalists, young people there who want to start doing reporting from their communities, because we feel that the voice needs to come from the community, not just be written about reporters who are reporting on the community. So we'll be doing a fellowship model later this year. And then the great thing from Trevor's reporting, these are 2 women in a town in northern British Columbia who are on the opposite sides of the pipeline debate. They live in the same town. They never actually had met except for online. And when they met online, they hated each other. They would just at each other all the time because they were on opposite sides of an issue. Trevor got them to come and have coffee. They ended up, they didn't exactly fall in love, and they haven't exactly changed their minds, but they realized they had much more in common than they didn't. They also realized that they both loved horses, and the weekend after they first met, they went horseback riding together. These are sort of intractable opponents about a really significant issue, and we've been reporting on them ever since. So, so that was kind of cool. Down nearer Vancouver, this is an existing tank farm of a pipeline that already comes from the tar sands. There's a proposal that's just been approved by the federal government to double the size of this pipeline, which would add 4 times the amount of tanker traffic into Vancouver Harbour with threatened endangered killer whales. There's a whole bunch of things wrong with this. And so this is called the Trans Mountain Pipeline. And remember that, because you're going to hear a lot about that, because if you've heard about Standing Rock, which was the big fight in North Dakota, on the pipeline issue there, this is going to be the world's next Standing Rock. There's going to be huge protests. This is a really nasty issue. And so Trevor is now taking some of what we learned in northern BC, and he's actually writing a weekly newsletter now. We're using Google Forms to ask people in communities all along. I think there's 57 communities along the pipeline route. We're asking them what are the questions they have about how this should be covered. Is this good for their community? Is it bad for the community? And that will inform all the reporting that we do, because we know we're going to be doing reporting on that because it's right in our backyard. So one other quick thing I'll reference is this is Brielle Morgan. So she's working on an engagement strategy called Challenge for Change, and it's basically an audio-based engagement with young people in Vancouver who are in probably the most marginalized people in our country. They're kids who are in the care of the foster care system, the welfare system. They're separated from their families, they're marginalized on almost every imaginable level, and then half the kids in care in Vancouver or in British Columbia are Aboriginal children who've been separated from their families. And so these are the most sort of demonized, least understood population, and least, in a sense, powerful population that you could imagine. The media stories about them are sensational stories. The media stories about the problems with the child welfare system are also sensational stories. They're all crisis-driven. So these are the least trusting of media you could find. Brielle has spent almost now 6 months doing nothing but listening and recording interviews with them and their mums or their families and everything else, and gradually building their confidence. And we're about to start releasing a series of stories in advance of a forthcoming provincial election about the 700 recommendations for fixing the child welfare system in British Columbia, none of which have been essentially acted on apart from the really easy ones. And we're doing that from the stories and the voices of these marginalized kids. So it's a very deep listening process that we've been engaged in, and we've managed to find funders now who supported this. And actually, the funders got so enthusiastic about it, they put in enough money to start a new non-profit organisation in Canada that wants to take this listening method Canada-wide. And that non-profit now pays us to deliver the service that we've developed. So that's another way to monetize this, which is come up with a good enough idea that somebody wants to create an entity that wants to do that more broadly, and you're the only person who knows how to do it, so they have to pay you to do it for them. So that sort of works. Finally, and this is a bit more fun, this is actually a product placement. I was asked by the Canadian government to put a picture of the Rocky Mountains and a train in my presentation. I get a free trip. No, well, it's actually, this is just Canada's sort of tourism porn, but what this whole listening process that Brielle's been involved in Vancouver with this tough population, the Challenge for Change has now thought, well, why don't we also try and take that whole methodology and do something across Canada? And so this summer they've got some students who are going to go and do these deep listening events, not about child welfare, but just about people's concerns, but they're going to do it on the train that crosses Canada. So they're going to go back and forth across Canada on the train, and those events are going to be broadcast nationally too. So back to where we started, and I'm almost done. So this year we're doing Power Struggle again. We've got 4 fellows this year, not 9, and we're concentrating Power Struggle in 4 regions, 4 countries in sub-Saharan Africa. And then the 5th person, the guy in the middle down the bottom with the goatee, that's Richard Popak. He's a South African-based journalist who's kind of helping to organise this approach. So not only are we doing solutions-based engagement journalism in sub-Saharan Africa about energy access this year, but Richard is putting together an investigative series based on Canada's lobbying and its very strange behaviour as a sort of trading nation when it comes to subsidising and investing in energy-related projects in Africa and the consequences of Canada's investments in doing that. So, where's the money? 43% of our revenue last year came from engagement journalism. At the moment, we are using newsletters, questionnaires, we're developing new beats, we're spending long periods in critical communities like Brielle has done without reporting initially. We're doing data journalism, we're trying to solve for news poverty, we're networking journalists, we're networking community members using various tools. Basically everything we do and every tool we have starts and ends with two questions. Does our reporting serve a community need? Does it have the potential to have significant positive social impact? So we ask ourselves those questions. We ask the communities how they would like to see that happen. And if we can satisfy them and ourselves that there's some reporting to do, then we go and do it. We have not yet found the room for, and we don't think yet the market for a subscription-based model like Rob's, which I think all admire and are in awe of, but we would like to test that out later this year. We're also doing an investment capital raise fairly soon. We're going to crowdfund, we hope, some of our beats. We're staging events, selling data, and as I said, hopefully duplicating something like Rob's success with Der Correspondent through a subscription model. So we're placing a very big bet in the end on the idea that engagement-driven journalism is not just the right thing to do, but it's frankly the only thing to do in journalism's brave new world. Thank you.
And our time is up. No. I'll keep it short. I don't have a PowerPoint presentation, so you have to do with my face, which I'm sorry for. Let me start by, when I walked to here and I looked at the title of this panel, already the whole title bugged me about monetizing communities, because I don't think any community was ever built for monetizing it. I mean, nobody wants to be part of a community that's there for monetizing it. I think the only way to actually build a community to monetize is to have some core values shared by that community that you want to promote, whether it is social change or whether it is informing each other or whatever. So starting a community-based journalism model is all about one question and one question only for me, which is, why are you doing this? It's not about how. The how follows from the why. The why is the hardest question to ask or to answer. So the Correspondent started as a crowdfunding 4 years ago, and our why was very simple. The reason why we started the Correspondent is because of the problem we have with real news. There's been a lot of talk in the last couple of months about the problem of fake news. But I think the biggest problem our society has is not with fake news, but with real news. Real news portrays the world in all kinds of ways that makes you completely misinformed about what is going on around you. So our basic why, our basic philosophy was to create an antidote against news, an antidote, like a medicine to the problem of news. And I can go into what the problem of news is in detail. I won't, because it'll take a few days. But the basic problem of news we have is that the promise of journalists today is that if you follow the work they do, you will understand what is happening around you. But if you look at let's say the core product journalists make, news stories, the one thing you don't get is an understanding of what is happening around you. You can see this primarily when big shifts in the world happen, like, for example, the election of Donald Trump as President of the United States, or Brexit, or the financial crisis in 2008. The discussion afterwards, after those big geopolitical shifts, is always, how did we miss this? How couldn't we have seen this coming? And I think one main reason is that the main focus of news outlets is that they're not looking at structural daily change in society and only focus on exceptions to that change. So news is generally about the exceptions to the rule. It is what is not happening every day. So this is one of the reasons why, for example, climate change is almost never on the front page, because you can't say the climate is changing today. It is, and it's changing every day, but just because it's changing every day, it's never in the news. So our metaphor and our promise to our readers is that we don't want to talk about weather, which is news, and we want to talk about climate. So what is the structural change in society that influences our lives on a daily basis? We don't talk about what happens today, we talk about what happens every day. And to do this in a good way, you can't do this without a community informing you. So the reason why we have a community-based journalism model is that we can't put out stories, or we can't make stories about deeply undercovered structural changes in society if we don't have the community that informs us about those changes. So basically what we did is we built a platform where journalists, we call them correspondents, all have their own beat about a significant development that they think should be covered. And what our model is, we work together with our readers to uncover those developments. So for example, I don't know, you can say bureaucracy in healthcare, for example, is a big issue in the Netherlands. We want to understand how this came about, how it affects the work of doctors, for example, how it affects the life of patients in hospitals, and also how can we change the problems that it gives. And you can't do this without talking to as many doctors, patients, managers in hospitals as possible. So the basic idea for our community is to help us understand what is going on in the world. So it's actually pretty much exactly the other way around for you. We don't ask what don't you know, and what would you like to for us to figure out, which is an interesting model as well. But we we ask the exact opposite question. So what do you know? And help us learn from your knowledge and expertise to make the journalism we want to make. So most of our stories start out with a call out to our readers saying, here's the thing we want to investigate. What do you know about this? And this can be anything. So for example, one of our most successful recent projects we did was our climate change correspondent who wanted to figure out how one of the biggest oil companies in the world was tackling climate change, or wasn't tackling climate change, Royal Dutch Shell. And he said, I don't want the official PR story, I want to know how, from the inside, how does this company work, and how does it view climate change, and what do they think should be done about it. So he said, do you work at Shell, or have you worked at Shell, and do you want to talk to me about it? This can be done anonymously or on the record. And what followed was like a series of conversations from people who saw that call out and reached out to our correspondent and told them about the inner workings of this company, which led to not only like the traditional journalistic scoops about how, for example, Shell lied about what they knew about climate change, and also about how they financed groups that produced skepticism about climate change, but also just an insight into how this company operates. And this is basically what we try to give people, like insight in how the world works. And a big part of this philosophy is also what we call constructive journalism, which is focused on not explaining what is wrong with the world, but actually what is how the world works. So if you want to know how to solve a problem or how to change the world, you have to know how the world functions in some basic sense. So explaining this and uncovering this like very everyday world around us is what our journalism is about. And then comes the monetization part, because I think if you provide a kind of journalism that helps people understand how the world around them works and how they can survive in that world, or how can they change that world, that is something worth money to people. Not only because they are part of a community, but also because there's actually a value to them in what you are providing. So I think for everyone who that wants to start a community-based journalism model, the first question is, why do you want to start this? And then every other answer about how to do this will follow from that why. There are many reasons why you wouldn't want a community-based model. I can think of many reasons why you don't want any interaction or contribution from your community at all. If you want to inform them about, I don't know, daily news stories that you see on TV every day, there's no need for any community, because there's no point in engaging that community in the first place. So the reasons why you do this is very important. So yeah, that's it.
Thanks for those presentations, they were great. I'm going to keep my questions real short so we can get some audience questions, but I can't let you out of the room without bringing up the expansion to the US that was announced a couple weeks ago. So I know it's in the earliest of days, but what do you see as the unique opportunities and challenges of the US market as compared to the Netherlands?
Well, first of all, the way we see it is we're trying not to like launch the correspondent in the US per se. We are based in the US, or we want to be based in the US for different reasons, but we think of it as expanding our platform into a different language, so expanding it to an English language. And one of the main reasons is very simple. If you publish in a world language like English, then you reach a lot of more people that know a lot more. So actually what we try to do is try to build the biggest Rolodex we can think of. And trying to get as many people who know what is happening in the world around us to come onto our platform and share that knowledge and expertise with us. Our basic idea is that most journalists don't know anything about what goes on in the world, and we need to have all kinds of ways to let people who are in that world inform us about that world. And if you do this in a world language like English, the quality of your information becomes better and better. I mean, the Netherlands is such a small country, and yet almost all developments in the world that really affect how we live, how the world, in which way the world is going, are not national in any meaningful sense anymore. So climate change or inequality or tax havens or whatever you can think of, the more people you can get from all over the world to contribute their knowledge about those things, the better it becomes.
Jen, you're in a unique position because you sell a product that both requires sort of philosophical shift in journalism as well as the shift of getting them to pay for a product that they hadn't been paying for before. Which do you find the tougher sell? Where do you see more resistance?
Oh, that's a great question. I think mindset shift is the first hurdle, because if we talk to a newsroom and there are many reporters whose eyes are lighting up and seeing the promise, and there's one person in the room who maybe is a manager or someone with some power who says, why would we want to listen to the audience? They're a bunch of idiots and assholes. Then just the air goes right out of the room. So first and foremost, you need to have kind of the fertile soil in order to plant this idea in. And a lot of newsrooms don't have that soil. They have different ideas for how the news should be done, which I I will be the first to say I don't think Harkin is the answer to doing all journalism. I think it's a really great complement to the current model that you can really ramp up to as much as you want. 50% of your news could be from outside of your newsroom, which would be amazing. It would be a game changer. So I think the mindset shift is first and foremost, and then the second part is them understanding that what we're selling is not a widget. It's a framework. It's a model. We do consulting. We do tons of stuff besides just like giving you a platform. So the platform is really there to support a mindset shift, and if you don't have the mindset shift, then the tools don't matter. So it's kind of like, I think, I don't know if the sword and the stone is a story everybody knows, but there's the sword stuck in the stone, and you have to have the right feeling in your heart in order to pull it out. That's kind of how I think about using our tools. They're useless. You can't get the sword out unless you're thinking differently. So that's the number one priority, really.
Ian, I wanted to quickly follow up on one thing in the presentation. You said 43% of your revenue is from engagement journalism. I'm just curious, how are you defining that? What are the sources of revenue that you would include in that 43%?
So about 50% of our revenue last year, actually probably about 43% of our revenue, was from philanthropic foundations. So we're a for-profit company, but we've managed to persuade at least some philanthropy in Canada that this is, and in the US actually, that what we're doing is worthwhile. So our revenue comes from either some contracts with foundations or with non-profit organizations who the foundations fund to hire us. Canada's a bit weird by comparison to the US, because in the US, the philanthropic funding of journalism is quite common. Doesn't mean it's not controversial, but there's the Knight Foundation you referenced earlier spends about $200 million a year on journalism. In Canada, you can't do that because the Canadian Revenue Agency, the tax agency, considers journalism a political act, which is probably true, but it should be a political act. So we've got to do workarounds to get philanthropic support, but most of what we've done in the engagement space has come from that.
Want to leave a little time for audience questions? Are there any? Yeah. With the glasses?
Oh.
Yeah.
Oh, there's a mic.
Oh, mic coming around.
Oh, please.
I'll repeat the question. If you're loud, I'll repeat the question back.
Prova.
Okay.
Thanks. My question would be for Rob. You were dealing until now with a market that you knew quite well, the Dutch market. Once you go in English, you will address to a market that it's potentially global. How do you deal with building a community within a market or a public that is potentially global? How do you manage to know your clients, your users, your subscribers, as well as you would do with the Dutch in a global environment?
Right, it's a very good question, because most, let's say, imagined communities that we are used to in journalism are national communities. So actually there is the book Imagined Communities talks about how newspapers were like the foundation of nationalism, because they were all they represent the world as like you have this national country and then the rest of the world outside. That's still how most newspapers present the world to us. Our model is that community building is not about geographical criteria, but about shared interest, values, and goals. So, for example, let's take the transition to a renewable energy economy, and how we can get there, and why we should go there. This is a shared goal that you can have whether you live in the Netherlands or in the US or in Italy or wherever. And so building topical communities around shared interests and goals, that would be our main strategy. And doing this in English helps bring in a lot more people from all over the world.
I have a question for Mr. Weinberg as well. I was wondering, because you want to report the things that happen every day and you rely on your members to inform you about these shifts that happen every day, how you make sure your members actually represent or encompass different traits of society?
Right. This is the hardest part of our journalism, and it's also, I think, one of the biggest reasons why distrust in media is so rampant all over Western countries, is that there's a huge gap between the experience of everyday reality by millions of people and the people who work in journalism and their everyday life. There's a huge gap between those two. So I think, and this is very hard because there is already so many factors involved in how you recruit your journalists, where they come from, what they study, etc., etc. So I think the answer to your question is trying to be as diverse as possible in the people you attract in your newsroom, and really think about, okay, demographically, socially, with regards to political worldview, with regards to the environment they were brought up in or the environment they live. Am I representing communities all over the country, all over the world, or am I just like in some kind of elite filter bubble that has their own reality and talks about the world from that bubble? We haven't done we try to do this the best we can, but it's the hardest part of this kind of journalism, like representing the communities and getting to know the people who actually know these communities, are from these communities, to serve as your journalist in that community. Yeah.
You've all talked about engagement journalism from the perspective of organizations, small and large. And I'm curious what you would say with regard to independent journalists who want to incorporate some of these engagement principles but don't have an organization that they're necessarily embedded in. How would you suggest people do that? What are some models that an independent journalist who would be interested in these kind of principles could follow?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think, with our model, it would be taking a similar approach to figuring out, what are you interested in covering, and then going to the people who know about that and ask them, what don't they know? So instead of, I know, from experience when, I think everyone has had this story happen in their city where suddenly some journalist from a major outlet discovers something that everybody else knows about, and they're like, okay, yeah, we all know that place is cool. You just came to the party late. What if you could provide instead the thing for that community that they need to solve for or that they don't understand? So you could go to a community you're looking to cover and ask them what information or what's something that people don't know about you or something that you don't know that I could provide for you. So it's just a different mindset in saying, how can I kind of extract a story of something that already exists to how can I be an additive information contributor to a community that already exists. So you can do that with pen and paper, just spending time with people, but you can apply that same philosophy.
Yeah, I'll just add quickly, I've worked as a freelancer. I'd say it's really hard because the nature of freelance work is you're always moving to the next assignment. So I think it's really an argument for why we need to support institutions that hire journalists full time, because I think the reality is there's little things that you can do. You can look for grant money to do an event, to do engagement, but it runs counter to the kind of business logic of freelance and independent journalism. So I think we need more people like The Correspondent hiring journalists like Discourse Media that they get paid to do that kind of engagement work.
Yeah.
And I've told that's our last question and all we have time for. But thank you for joining the panel, and appreciate it. Thank you. the John S. And James L. Knight Foundation for their support of this session in conjunction with the development of an interactive platform to spread best practices engagement across the globe. As one of the collaborators on that project, I'm excited to share that we now have a name. It's Gather, as well as a landing page where you can find out more about what we've been up to and our plans to launch this spring. So that's letsgather.in. I'll allow the panelists to tell you more about themselves and their work shortly, but just a quick introduction. On the far end is Rob Weinberg from The Correspondent, co-founder and editor-in-chief. Next to him, Ian Gill from Discourse Media, based in Canada. He's the president. And next to me is CEO and founder of Harkin, Jen Brandel. And I'm Ben DeJarnett, project and product manager for Gather. I will pass it off shortly to Jen and the rest of the panelists to do sort of a 10-minute introduction, presentation, then we'll do a little bit of discussion and then open it up to questions from the group. But I first wanted to kind of set the stage for the conversation by explaining what we mean by engagement, as well as why the business question is so important right now. I liked my colleague Andrew Devagal's definition so much that I borrowed his slide. So when we're talking about engagement at the Agora Journalism Center, and really on this panel, less about clicks, likes, retweets, social media metrics, as it is about. Yeah. Nice. I started to eat, and then the nerves were hitting in. I was like, I'm just gonna put this off until. So I have a sandwich in my bag. It was very good. Rob doesn't have any slides, but yeah. All right, y'all ready to go? Cool. All right. Check. All right. All right, I think we have a full room and a full panel, so we'll get ahead and get started. Welcome to our panel examining the business case for engaged journalism, which is part of a series of sessions on engagement at this year's festival. I'd like to specifically thank IJF for supporting this series, as well as the Agora Journalism Center, the gathering place for innovation and communication and civic engagement at the University of Oregon. Thanks also for listening to our audience, telling the stories of our communities with them and not just for them, and turning our sources into storytellers in a way that enriches journalism and engages our communities. In terms of the business side, I could talk a long time about that, but I'll try and just share two numbers that I think sort of capture a snapshot of where we're at. One of them is 65%. That's the amount of total digital advertising revenue that went to just two companies in 2015, Google and Facebook, leaving everyone else on the internet to fight over the other 35%. That sort of dovetails into the other number I wanted to share, which is $28 billion. That's the revenue gap between what U.S. newspapers have gained in digital ad revenue over the last decade compared to what they've lost in print advertising revenue. So just to put numbers on that, between 2004 and 2014, digital advertising revenue for U.S. newspapers grew by $2 billion. During that same period, print advertising fell by $30.3 billion. So all that's to say, digital ad revenue, it's a big part of the pie. It's not going anywhere. It's important for journalism. But increasingly, it's not enough, which is why it's great that we have three people here who are really on the front lines of figuring out what next and how else we can support journalism through reader revenue and other opportunities. And the first of those I'd like to pass it off to is Jen Brandell from Harkin.
There we go. Now it is. Thank you, Ian. Right on. Excellent. So I am really excited to tell you about the company I've been running for the last year and a half called Harkin, which the word itself means to listen. And forgive me, because it's going to be about 70% explaining what Harkin is, and then we'll get to the monetization at the end, because it really requires an understanding of the nuances of the relationship dynamics, and then you'll see why there's money here. So we help news organizations listen to the public way before they publish stories to make sure that they're doing relevant and valuable work. Quick backstory, I was a reporter for a long time at WBEZ in Chicago. I founded a series there called Curious City that started with the audience's curiosity, and now I'm scaling that idea with Harkin. And so the main question I was obsessed with as a reporter for a really long time is trying to figure out how to know whether stories were valuable or not before reporting and without having to guess. Because right now, with the model that journalism currently has, you can't know for sure before reporting or without guessing. And the way that we found out that you can do this is just putting the public first instead of last in the process. And I'll show you what I mean by this. So typically, most news stories don't have the public involved in any meaningful way until it's too late. After publication, after broadcast, that's when the public can come in, maybe they can comment, which we know does not bring out the best in humanity all of the time, and doesn't always lead to actionable, meaningful insight into who the public is and what they care about. So what we've done instead is really, so this traditional model, I should say, another way of putting it, is that it's like the newsroom saying, here's what we think you need to know, at a distance, looking at the audience as an abstract group of people, and not really working with them beforehand. So on the flip side, what we've been working on for the last few years is changing this model completely and starting with the audience instead of ending with them and putting them first throughout the process. And so we call this a public-powered story cycle because without the public, these stories don't happen. It's not that the newsroom decides what to do and then they sprinkle a little public on the story. It's without the public, they don't exist. And so it all begins with collecting the public's questions. In other words, it's asking this: what do you not know that we could help you find the answer to? This is the posture that the newsroom takes. Instead of saying, we know what you need to know, we say, what don't you know? And the other two aspects of this, and having the public be involved, is that they can vote on each other's ideas. So you can curate the best questions that come in and let the public ultimately decide what you report on. And then the public can also follow you as you're doing the story and contribute their expertise, their insight, see what's happening as it's happening. So those are the three main ideas behind Harkin. And in the last year and a half, we've spread from 3 newsrooms to more than 80 in 18 languages around the world, testing this model in lots of different ways. And we built a custom platform in order to make this simple to do, because really, it's a mental shift more than anything, but when you want to do this over and over again, none of the existing tools make it easy for reporters. So we ended up building a custom tool set to make it easy. So we have these little modules where the public can ask questions, modules where they can vote. This new tool we're just coming out with, we're very excited about, called Open Notebook, where the reporter can show their work as they're going and be transparent about everything that they're doing. And it all ties together in what we call an EMS, so like a CMS, a content management system, but for engagement instead. And so how newsrooms work with this is oftentimes they'll embed these modules on their stories, embed them in sidebars, and collect the audience's feedback as they go. And another cool thing that they can do is when the public, let's say, vote